Welcome to the Money Over 50 podcast, brought to you by Dallas Davison and Michael Hogue from Money Over 50 Financial Advisors. This information is general in nature and does not take into account your objectives, financial situation, or needs. Therefore, you should consider whether the information is appropriate for you and your personal circumstances. If you require personal advice, please contact Money Over 50 Financial Advisors. Here are your hosts, Dallas Davison and Michael Hogue.
Welcome to Money Over 50. Today we're here with a listener question. This one is from Linda. Linda, thanks for your question. Michael, I'll hand over to you because you've actually done all the research on this, but essentially what we're looking at here is building a separate two-bedroom cottage on existing acreage to rent out.
That's right. So thanks, Linda. Yeah, so the email came through from Linda. It starts off, "Hello, Dallas and Michael. Thanks for your wonderful podcast."
I like the way you just had to add that in there.
Exclamation point. You're welcome, Linda. So it goes on to say, for someone with $200,000 in cash, she points out that they're 5 years away from retirement in their circumstance, is investing some of this cash into a nice home extension, a cottage, which would allow for dual occupancy. Is it not a better option than putting that money into our superannuation funds? ? The cottage would provide an income stream over the next 5 years and also provide an income stream into the retirement years. The estimated gross rent that Linda has worked off is $350 per week. So she asked another question: isn't $18,200 of rent or $350 a week in rent less any tax plus an additional value to the home of more value than $200,000 in super, returning an assumed rate of return of 8%, $16,000 per annum? She goes on to say, "Hope this all makes sense, and would love if you can actually go through the figures for a podcast. Many thanks, Linda." So, thanks for your topic, Linda.
I really like this one. I like these listener questions that are. I think this is something that we. It's obviously specific to Linda and their situation, but we see this a lot. This is something that we do see. People normally have their sort of home as is one of their biggest assets. Where the majority of their net worth is tied up, and you get to the point where you're thinking about how to optimize everything, how to grow your position over that last 5-10 years, and this is an option as a way to how do we work this a bit harder, and how do we use all of our available resources, and so it's the specifics are a bit different, but this is a fairly common thing of people thinking, I'll put a granny flat on the house, or I'll subdivide, or I'll do something like that. And so it's a good real life case study that we can talk through, that we'll be able to also go through in some of the more generic pros and cons of this approach.
Yep. So I'll go through some other information. So Linda goes into series of emails went back and forth between myself and her after that. Yeah. So she goes in to say that they're on the Sunshine Coast, they're on acreage. She estimates the build cost would be closer to $150,000 rather than $200,000.
I'm going to jump.
We're going to say everything blows out.
I'm going to say, whenever someone says I estimate that it costs closer to $150 than $200, I assume $220.
Yeah, so we've worked on 200. Yeah. I think you want to work on, anytime you're building, you want to work on not everything going the way that you thought it would be. Yeah, would go. It's not all smooth sailing, of course.
Yeah.
So Linda goes on to mention that down the track, if we wanted, these are exact words, down the track, if we wanted, we could move into the smaller cottage. So they're thinking about building this 2-bedroom cottage on the existing land. The larger house is separate to that. And then they could rent out the main house for, say, $600 per week. Her other thoughts are that they might rent the larger house out to the family and move into the smaller cottage down the track. I guess all of this part of it, I think, is a separate question.
Yeah.
And it's a separate It's one of those things that it's very, very hard to tie into. We have to do the numbers, and then Linda, you'd have to actually you'd have to weigh the lifestyle option around that. That could be good, because her thoughts are, if we had family living close by in the larger house for some company and social time, perhaps even some supporting care if required when in later years, it may delay actually going into aged care. It's very, very hard to factor that all in at this point in time. So we've just looked at the pure numbers of what would it cost to build, what would likely rent be, what are the pros and cons of that, because it's a little bit hard to go into that. There's just so many variables at play there.
I think the way to do it and sort of how you've broken it down, Michael, is to look at it as different in different frames. So if you look at over the next 5 years, 10 years, what does that look like?
Yep.
In those early years of retirement, what does that look like? And then at that point in time, obviously we don't know those numbers, but we can, when we get to that point, as you've gone through this example, we can discuss some of the things to think about with that. So did you want to run through your
Yes,
numbers?
I'll go through the numbers. So let's sum up again. What we're looking at here is Linda is considering on their existing acreage, which seems to be a reasonable number of acres on the Sunshine Coast, building a detached 2-bedroom cottage, brand new, on the existing land and actually renting that out. So working on a total investment of $200,000, and Linda does go on to say that they actually have that in cash, which is good.
Yep.
So we've got that in cash. They'll come in. That's quite important because obviously being in cash, it's liquid at the moment.
Yep.
And it could actually go into superannuation to potentially even claim as a tax deduction over these next few years as well. So, but if we look at the cost of the property, so you're getting a brand new property in this case for $200,000. I've worked on Linda's assumption of $350 a week for rent. I've used an average of 49 weeks a year for rental, so missing 3 weeks a year in rent. Changeover between tenants. You also, I mean, a property is just never fully tenanted all the time. Yeah, so if someone rents it for a few years, they move out, it stays vacant for a couple of months, and then someone else comes in there.
Yep. So
an average of weeks per year, $350 a week in rent gives you $17,150 of net rent before we take into consideration the costs. Rates and water, I have no idea the extra rates and water that this would cost. It would cost something, of course. You're adding toilets, and that's a cost. I've assumed $500 for extra rates and water. I've assumed $500 for insurance. Again, I feel that cost would probably be more. It's a detached property.
Yep.
I would think it's probably a lot more than that. You have to insure the
landlord's insurance.
Landlord's insurance as well.
Yeah.
I've assumed no real estate management fee. I've assumed that they'd manage it themselves, being right there. I have allowed for advertising and miscellaneous of $500 a year.
Just to get someone in.
Just to get someone in. That actually could go towards the insurance because I think I've underquoted there.
Yeah.
General maintenance every year, $500. So that'd be calling out an electrician or a plumber, once a year. Obviously that might be a little bit less in the early years when it's brand new, but it's always going to be something. Long-term maintenance. Now, long-term maintenance, I've got at $4,300 per year, and people would think that's a little bit high. Here's where I've come up with that figure. A paint inside and out every 15 years. Obviously, that's all done at the start, so you don't have to do that at the start. Yeah. Paint inside and out every 15 years. How long is a piece of string? I've allowed $30,000 for that amount. If we divide that as a per annum cost, that's $2,000 per annum for paint inside and out. Replace split system air conditioners every 15 years. I'm acutely aware that that's how long they only last.
Haven't gone through that.
That's $12,000 every 15 years, $800 a year. And replace bathrooms, kitchen, floor coverings every 20 years, $30,000. I've allowed for that. And that's a fact.
And this is a, so for more details about this, and before anyone says, well, that's, not how it works, whatever. If you go back, and there's a podcast that we've done recently, what was it called? Depreciation is a real expense.
Yes.
And talking about the concept that these costs, because they don't come out every year, you don't have to come up with $4,000 cash every year. It's easy to forget that that's a real expense, in that to keep this property in the condition in which it needs to be, you're going to have to outlay those costs are going to come up at some stage. So whether it's 15 years or 20 years or 17 years or 12 years, we're just kind of coming up with a ballpark here. But I think that what you've sort of explained there, Michael, is trying to show that there is a real cost, whether you think it's slightly more or slightly less. It's got to be in the ballpark of those figures, you'd think.
So this part actually gets a little bit technical. So let's just go back over that. The holding costs, if we go back to saying we're going to paint this house inside and out every 15 years, $30,000. We're going to replace split systems, air conditioners every 15 years, $12,000. And we're going to replace the bathroom, the kitchen, the floor coverings every 20 years. That's $30,000 every 20 years. All of those costs on an annual basis come to $4,300 per annum. To be really, really fair here, I'm not going to have that cost come in from day one, though, because we've got a brand new property over here. So I'm actually going to have that cost come in from year 10. Therefore, what I'm going to look at is I'm going to actually halve that $4,300 of cost, and I'm going to actually make that not $4,300 a year. I'm going to make that $2,150 per year.
Yeah.
Over an average of 20 years, because some of those costs aren't going to come in for 15 years. Some of those costs aren't going to come in for 20 years, but they're going to come in. They're going to come in. So thinking of that another way is that every single year, if you took $2,150 of the rent and allocated that into what they call a sinking fund, a separate account, what would happen is that when these costs started to come in, such as paint inside and out in 15 years' time, replace the split system in 15 years' time, you'd have the money in the sinking fund to do that. It would drop, and then in 20 years' time, you need to replace the bathrooms, the kitchen, the floor coverings, all those types of things. You'd have that money in that sinking fund, and then it'd be exhausted. And that would be by putting an average of $2,150 a year into that fund. So let's go through the costs again. First of all, the income coming in, rent, $350 per week times 49 weeks on average rented for the year, $17,150. I'm then going to go through my costs, rates and water. $500 is going to come off the rent for rates and water, $500 for insurance, $500 for advertising and miscellaneous, $500 for general maintenance, so it's having a plumber or a sparky come once a year. So on top of that, $2,150 we need to allocate for those longer term expenses, such as the paint, the replace the split systems and the bathrooms. What we're at with a total cost coming off the rent there is $4,150. So $17,150 comes in. $4,150 goes out in those costs. By the way, we'll make these figures available in spreadsheet format to anyone who emails in at podcast@mo50.com.au. We'll email you the spreadsheet so you can go through these. Total cost $4,150. Now, what that does is it actually drops my rent from $17,150 after I've taken into consideration the costs. It drops it to $13,000 for the year. And this is the first thing that we find don't often factor in. $13,000 of rent is $250 a week. So it's vastly different from the $350 a week that when you do your figures, people always think of the gross rental, not the net rental.
Yep.
So I think I've been fairly.
Yeah, I reckon.
I think I've been fair.
I think you've been fair. I think you've been very, very fair there. We'll talk separately. Like, I think when we look at the longer term perspective, I think you've probably been a bit lean there with those costs. As we said, in 20 years' time, that's then a 20-year-old property. So those maintenance things are going to be a higher yearly amount because you're not they're going to come around quicker.
Yes.
If that makes sense. So, but for I guess for the next, say, 20, 30 years, if we look at that that's very fair, I'd say probably, erring on the side of being a bit lean even, but I'll let it slide and I won't jump in and can your calculations.
So now if we look at the return and we say, okay, property, we've got a $200,000 property here, then the rental, the net rental after stripping out those costs is $13,000 a year. And then we look at the capital growth of that. I'm gonna average that at 2.5%. And why I'm going to average that at 2.5% is that's what the Reserve Bank of Australia's targeted inflation rate is, 2.5% per year. With property, a 2-bedroom cottage does not turn into a 4-bedroom cottage because none of that rent is put back into the property to build more and more. So generally property over time grows with what inflation grows with, and that's all we can assume. So basically a 2.5% capital growth rate would be $5,000 for the year. So we have a $200,000 property. It pays us rent after those expenses of $13,000. It gives us 2.5% capital growth on average. We're at $18,000 in total return. So if we compared putting that $200,000 into, now when we say superannuation, and Linda uses that term superannuation, what we're implying here is that we actually invest that into a diversified group of the great companies of Australia and the world. So you spread that money out, not into the best companies, but into a broad group of companies. I mean, our ideal or our targeted rate of return is 8% per annum, Dallas. If you're able to get that 8% rate of return, then the $200,000 would return $16,000 for that particular year. So the property in this example marginally beats it because it's
basically an $18,000 total return as compared to a $16,000 total return.
Yep.
So so those are the numbers. Now, do you want me to pull this to pieces, or are you going to do it?
Well, the comments that I've made here. So on these numbers, the property total return in the earlier years is marginally better than the super, $18,000 versus $16,000. This would diminish as the property ages.
Yeah, so that's the point I was just making before. Sorry, I'm just you go through. I'll just jump in as I think of things. That's exactly as I was saying there. You've reduced those maintenance costs. You've basically halved them for the first in the early stages. Whereas in 20 years' time, they would go back to that more averaged out figure because you've got a 20-year-old property versus a brand new property.
That's right.
So that's kind of what you're saying is that total return, if you look at that as that maintenance cost goes up on average by a couple of $1,000s a year, that's kind of the difference. So if in 20 years' time you're looking at it, you'd basically say, well, instead of getting that $18,000 total return, it's probably closer to 16 after that little bit of increase.
That's right.
Yeah. So you're back to about square as that property ages.
One of the pluses is that Linda already owns the land. So if you had to say pay $200,000 to buy a block of land and then put a $200,000 property on that, it would lose out considerably to the super option because you would have $400,000 to go into the super
opportunity
fund.
cost is much higher. You've got more money tied up in there and not working for you.
So the fact that Linda actually owns the land is a plus, and it makes the numbers work better than it would, much better than it would if you actually didn't own the land. Mm-hmm. Liquidity is an issue with the property. So if I want extra money, I can't sell the bathroom. I have to sell the whole property if I want extra money. It'll only pay me the $13,000 a year in net rental.
Yeah. So if I need more than that $13,000 in net rental, so for example, when you're retired, if in a year you need more than that, if that money was invested in super, you could just take that bit extra out. Whereas having that money tied up in that cottage, you can't do that. You can't get more than your $13,000.
Yes. Yeah. Risk is an issue with the property as well because really it's one property in one geographical location. Comparatively, you could own 1,700 of the world's best companies, but the world's best and most diversified companies with the superannuation option.
The other issue that I see there as a risk factor or something to take into account is that when you look at, and I guess it ties into liquidity a bit, if you've got a property that is just one family home on that's a pretty easy sell. There's a lot of people looking for something like that. Whereas when you add on something like this, there are going to always be some people who are looking for a property like this, but your pool of buyers is much smaller. So it's probably going to either, you're going to have to take a bit of a discount when you go to sell it if you're in a bit of a hurry. And that's kind of ties in, as you're saying. What you really need then is when you go to sell this property, you're going to need someone who wants this exact type of property with that house and that cottage in that exact location compared to just someone who wants a house in that location. Yep. And that's where you risk. And it's funny because that word is not what people would normally associate with property, but it is just a thing where you're making this more of a niche asset and you're reducing the amount of people that will want that exact asset at the point in time that you go to sell it.
Yep. The other thing that we haven't factored in because we just don't know Linda's situation is that that $200,000 could potentially, if it does go into superannuation,
be claimed as a tax
deduction. Yep. So of course, if you put $200,000 in straight away between a couple, a husband and a wife, you wouldn't be able to claim all of that money as a tax deduction, even using the carry forward concessional contributions.
No.
However,
some portion of it
you would be able to potentially.
Yeah. So what we've sort of compared there is if you just put the $200,000 in completely as an after tax contribution, you only got you don't get any of that tax advantage on the way in. You just get that return within there.
Yeah, that's correct. So I guess to use an example, if Linda, yourself, and your husband had only $10,000 of employer contributions going in to your superannuation fund over the last 3 financial years, and you hadn't been actually making contributions into your super fund, I think. Well, it's probably not fair to assume anything, but let's. No,
but I think because you and this will, like you say, a bit of guesswork. Linda has mentioned is the rent less any tax. So I'm assuming that they must have some taxable income. There's obviously they're looking for tax deductions. So in that case, if you've got an extra $15,000 a year that you could be putting into super and claiming as a tax deduction, you could carry forward that 3 years. Again, assuming here that it's Linda and her husband, they could both put $45,000 each into super and claim a full tax deduction. Using that example, in this particular year, which is 2020-21, and then from 2021-22, you could actually you could trickle in $15,000 every year.
Every year. Now you might say there's an opportunity cost because you've got $200,000 sitting in cash that whole time. You can actually invest that money. You can replicate the investment strategy. If you want to trickle money into super and get the best tax deduction over the next 5 years of your working life.
You could invest that money outside.
You can invest that money in an identical investment, so spread across, in this example, the great companies of Australia and the world, and you can pull money out, $15,000 each year, and put that into super. I mean, you do bring into play potential capital gains tax issues by taking $15,000 out. However, generally speaking, that's minimal comparatively to the fact that you're putting that money into super, claiming it at, say, a 34.5% tax rate or tax deduction on the way into super and paying only 15% tax from your super fund. So that's potentially another way to look at that. Again, it's all guesswork and assumptions, but if you thought of it as if that's an option for Linda and her husband, then that $200,000, what you effectively do is if they could contribute that into super over the next 5 years of their working life, so they're 5 years out from retirement, if you assume that they can get all of that into super and claim a tax deduction on that,
they basically get a 35% tax deduction. They pay a 15% contributions tax. They're picking up an extra 20% return on that. Yep. So it's like they get $240,000 invested for the cost of $200,000.
Yeah.
So that's sort of how I'd think of it. Is if that is possible to them, that's then how you need to redo that calculation. Is that you're comparing a $200,000 property versus actually getting $240,000 into super once you take into account the extra tax refunds that you get, which then, if that's a possibility, it skews the numbers back in the direction of putting that money into super.
So they're the figures.
So I guess, so now I've been sitting here very patiently, and I haven't even been saying yes as we go along, because I notice that I do that in podcasts and it's very annoying. So apologies to listeners. But some of the thoughts that I have around this are that this is, to me, and this is, I guess, why it's an interesting example, because this is the absolute best case of if this situation was, we see a lot of these people going to do an extension or going to build a little something or subdivide or whatever. If Linda seems to be in the perfect situation to make this happen, and even in the perfect situation, the numbers are only marginally better in the early years, and then they basically swap across to being about the same situation in sort of 10 years and beyond. So you're better off to the tune of about $2,000 a year by doing this, and that's assuming everything goes exactly right. You have no issues with tenants, you have no issues with maintenance, you have no issues with that. It's assuming that when you go to sell the property, you can find the buyer that you need. It assumes that, that you do get that growth each year. It assumes all those sorts of things. The question you then got to ask yourself is, for the sake of $2,000 a year, do I want the headaches? And I don't know. It depends on different people value different things. But for me personally, if someone said you can put this $200,000 into super and get $16,000 a year, or you can deal with building and council permits and all these sorts of things, and having a tenant and having to share your property with someone else is the other thing. Having to have someone live next door that's a stranger that you're charging rent for, and then they're not paying their rent and all the rest of it. You can have all of that, all those headaches, and you're going to be better off to the tune of $2,000 a year. I think I'd rather just look for the extra return somewhere else.
Well, I can speak for myself as well, Dale. So when I retire, what I want the ability to do is travel the world and not have to worry about tenants moving in or plumbers coming and going and all that sort of stuff. I want to outsource the worry to the 1,700 CEOs of the best companies in Australia and the world, and just go. And just not worry about that sort of stuff. So, Linda, you mentioned other possible pluses, and if all of that pan out, if family members, so you got 4 children. Linda's gone on to say that you got 4 children. So, if it did pan out, there could be very good reasons to do this, which would be if it did suit them, one of your children and their families, to move into the larger house down the track, and then you moved into the 2-bedroom cottage, then it certainly could work out at that point in time. So there's other reasons that you may do this.
That is, sorry, Michael, a good point that I forgot to make, that I was going to touch on there, which is that I wouldn't, if it was me, I wouldn't be inclined to do this now, because I'm going to be $2,000 better off. So it's about the same, really, over the course of the next 5 years. And for the next 5 years, while you're working, you probably don't want the headaches, because you've got a job and you've got things to focus on. In the early years of retirement, you probably still don't want the headaches, because you want to be able to travel and just up and go and do all that sort of thing. Now, if in 20 years' time, it then did make sense to do that, what I would be inclined to do is just build the thing then in 20 years' time.
That's a good point I think you make there, Dallas, because a lot of what Linda had mentioned in the email was things that might work out in 20 years' time. So you're right. You could delay it for that 20 years. You could put the money to use in your superannuation fund. It's neither here nor there. in terms of you've got a lot less worry.
Yeah. Yep.
When we look at the numbers, $18,000 of assumed return with the property versus $16,000 a year with the super option. That's neither here nor there. That's not going to make a big difference over that period of time.
Yeah.
So you could wait that period of time, and then if one of your children and their families does want to move into the bigger house at that point in time, then you can actually build the property at that point in time.
This gets into one of your favourite things to do, Michael, which is siloing money and allocating that money for that. So, you don't actually need to do this, but if you could actually have a separate superannuation account, which is you put the $200,000 in, and you could say, we're going to pull the $13,000 of rental income, which is what we were sort of expecting anyway.
Yep.
We're going to pull that out every year, and we're going to live on that. And the rest of it, we're just going to let that grow. We're going to let that do its thing, so that then if in 20 years' time we do decide to do that, we've got that cash sitting right there. We don't have to worry about going and buying. We don't have to do anything like that. So that's sort of what I think you're talking about, is that when that money goes in with the rest of your super money, it can kind of just become an amorphous blob of retirement savings. Whereas if you were to say, right, we do want that. We think that in 20 years' time, one of our 4 kids will want to move into our home and we'll want to move in there, and then we can, have family close by, have that support, and that will extend the time before we have to go into aged care. You can do all that. I would just, rather than actually build it and then have to have it sitting there for 20 years and have the tenants and have the maintenance and have all the headaches, have that money sitting in a different account and just have that earmarked as, right, we know we've got that ready to go.
Yeah, look, it's a good point, because you can take advantage of the diversification, then you can take advantage of the tax deductions on the way in, assuming that you're not maxing out your contributions to super now. You can take advantage of the liquidity.
Yep.
You can take advantage of all of those things right now and still allow yourself the option. And it gives you time also to see, the way that, I guess, working life is now. Very rarely do you find adult children that, perhaps stay in that one city forever. Yeah. So potentially speaking, your kids could end up all over. And I don't know how old your children are, and I don't know if you have grandchildren, but like what we have seen in the past is that people with their adult children, they move to different parts of Australia, and all of a sudden they don't want to. The retirees don't actually want to be in that geographical region anymore. They won't actually want to be where the grandkids are.
Yes. And
so it's a funny one. Like we see people in retirement actually moving to be closer to where their grandkids are.
Well, and the thing about it is, you for the sake of, if you think of that, even if you assume that you are $2,000 better off per year, which, like I said, I think you've probably been a bit lean there, and so over the long term, it probably isn't quite like that. I'd think of that as I'd be willing to pay $2,000 a year to have the optionality up my sleeve, so that I know that if in 5 years' time or 10 years' time or 15 years' time, there's a few different things that could change at that point in time. Number one is obviously your personal situation. So anything could happen health-wise or in what you actually want to do in retirement that changes whether that's feasible or not. As you just touched on, then your kids and their situation and what they actually are doing could also be very different, and so you sort of want to leave your options up available there. The other big one is legislation. So we're sort of talking about, and that's kind of what I think you touched on that before around aged care. It's very hard to make decisions around what's best for you in terms of aged care or age pension or any of those sorts of things, or even when it comes to things like tax planning. We haven't even touched on the fact that there's then capital gains tax liability on the sale of this portion of your property and the rest of it. We just don't know what the rules or what the legislation will look like in 20 years' time, and whether it will still be the best thing to do to structure things in this way. So whereas we know that we can get that money into superannuation, we know that we can get a concessionally tax return on it now and then move it into account, pay no tax on the earnings, pay no tax on the income we draw out. And then in 20 years' time, if we worked out that, yes, the aged care rules are such that it makes sense to do that, we just take the money out tax-free and do it then. But we've bought ourselves another 20 years before we have to make that decision. And And, we see it every year. Every year there's a new rule for superannuation or for aged care or for age pension or something that changes the landscape of how things should be done. Over 20 years, there's going to be, 20 changes. And so it's really hard to make those decisions now around aged care this far in advance.
Yeah, so good point to make. It's a great point that you made there, Dallas. I think, and we tell people to stress test things, don't we? Usually say the superannuation option gives you the chance to stress test the fact that you still want to do this, and then a family member might move into the larger house, and then you might move into the 2-bedroom house. So it gives you that option to stress test that.
Yeah, interesting that you say that, because one of the ideas of something that you could do there is you could. I've seen this. I know I was just looking at Airbnbs, Nicola and I, last night for a trip away this year. You could potentially do something like put a caravan there and have someone come and Airbnb it for a week. And if after a week you go, geez, I hated sharing our property with someone else, you go, we definitely don't want someone there long term.
Yeah.
Or, someone comes and stays with you for a week. All those things where if you then decided you're going to do it, you did think that it still made sense for you financially. There are many, many things that I would do to test this and to trial it before you break ground on building and spending $200,000. And those are, sort of joking ideas, but it's not that crazy to just go, well, have someone come and stay with you for a week in a caravan or something that's completely separate from the house, and go, well, does it actually really annoy us to have to worry about someone else on the property? Because what you don't want to do is spend the $200,000 and have this white elephant that either A, no one wants to rent for $350 a week, or B, you don't actually want them there, and it's more of a burden, and you've just created a burden for yourself that you didn't need to, when there are sort of those simple options that are stack up financially much the same.
Thanks for your question, Linda. It was a good one. We enjoyed this one.
Yeah.
So keep them coming. So you can email through any topic or question that you have, or anything that you might like us to cover, to podcast@mo50.com.au. Additionally, if you want to see the calculations for this, feel free to email us as well, and we'll be only too happy to pass on the spreadsheet of calculations. That's podcast@mo50.com.au.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Money Over 50 podcast with Money Over 50 financial advisors. We look forward to catching up again soon.